Elena Whitmore heard the wolves howling before she heard her own brothers speak the words that would end her old life. She stood in the great hall of Whitmore territory, hands pressed flat against the wooden table, listening to Gareth and Colin argue in low voices, with three men wearing the black and silver colors of the Cade Pack. She was not meant to be there. She had walked in looking for her brothers to ask about supper, and instead, she had walked into the middle of her own future being decided without her. "She leaves at dawn," Gareth said. He did not look at her. He looked only at the Cade envoy, a tall man with a scar along his jaw who had introduced himself as Marcus. That was the agreement. The girl for the land and the treaty. Elena's stomach turned to ice. "The girl," she repeated. Her voice came out sharper than she meant it to. "You mean me?" Gareth finally turned. There was no shame in his face, only tiredness, the kind of tiredness that came from 3 years of war with the Cade Pack, of losing men, and land, and sleep. "Elena, sit down. Let us explain." "Explain what? That you sold me?" "It is not selling," Colin said quickly, too quickly. "It is a marriage alliance. The Alpha King of the Cade Pack has agreed to end the border conflict if you become his wife. Every family in this pack will be safer because of it. Our people will stop dying, Elena. Do you understand what that means?" She did understand. She understood that 6 young men from their pack had died in the spring skirmishes, and 12 more the autumn before that. She understood that farms near the border had been burned, that children slept afraid, that the war had eaten through 3 years of her brothers' lives, since their father died and left them in charge. She understood all of it, and none of it made the ground under her feet feel any less like it was falling away. "You should have asked me," she said quietly. "Would you have said yes?" Gareth asked. She did not answer, because she did not know. That silence was worse than any argument. It told her the truth. Her brothers had known she might refuse, so they had not given her the chance. The Cade envoy, Marcus, cleared his throat. He was not unkind in his manner, but his eyes were careful, watching her the way a man watches a fire he is not sure is fully out. "The Alpha King is not a cruel man," he said. "Whatever you have heard about the Cade Pack in wartime, he does not mistreat what belongs to him." "I do not belong to anyone," Elena said. Marcus inclined his head, as if to say that was a debate for another day, not this one. That night, Elena did not sleep. She sat by her window and looked out over the fields of the only home she had ever known, at the low hills turning silver under the moon, and she let herself be angry in a way she had not allowed in front of her brothers. She thought of her mother, who had died when Elena was 12, and wondered what she would have said about a marriage built on land and blood debts instead of love. She thought of the stories the pack elders told about the Cade Pack, about their Alpha King, Daemon Cade, a man who had taken control of his territory at 22 after his father was killed in a border raid, a man who was said to be as cold as winter and twice as merciless. She had never met him. She had only heard his name spoken like something dangerous, something to be avoided, and now she was being wrapped in silk and sent to his door like a peace offering a farmer might leave outside a wolf's den, hoping it would be enough to keep the wolf from coming further. By the time dawn came, gray and quiet, Elena had cried all the tears she intended to allow herself. She dressed in the traveling clothes her maid, Grace, had laid out the night before, a deep blue dress that Grace said was chosen because it matched the Cade colors, a small gesture of goodwill. Elena thought it looked more like a woman dressing for her own funeral than her own wedding, but she said nothing. There was no point anymore in saying things that would not change what was coming. Grace helped her braid her hair, fingers gentle and quick, and when she was finished, she held Elena's face in both hands for a moment, the way she had when Elena was a small girl who had scraped her knee. "You are stronger than they know," Grace said. "Do not let them see you break." Elena held on to those words as she walked out to the carriage waiting in the courtyard. Her brothers stood there to see her off, and for one moment, Gareth looked as if he might apologize, might say something that would make this feel less like betrayal. Instead, he simply said, "Travel safely, sister," and stepped back. Colin, younger and softer than Gareth, could not meet her eyes at all. Elena climbed into the carriage without looking back. She had decided somewhere in the long hours of the night that she would not give her brothers the satisfaction of watching her cry over their choice. She would show the Cade Pack and the Alpha King they all seemed to fear, nothing but a woman who could not be broken by being handed from one house to another like a piece of furniture. The journey to Cade territory took 2 full days. Elena watched the landscape change through the carriage window, the familiar gentle hills of her home giving way to darker forests, taller mountains, a land that felt older and wilder the further they traveled. She did not speak much to the guards who escorted her, though one of them, a young woman named Iris, who seemed to have been assigned as her personal attendant for the journey, tried a few times to make conversation. "The Alpha King's territory is beautiful once you see it properly," Iris offered on the second day, when the silence in the carriage had grown heavy. "The mountains keep the winters short, and the packlands are rich. You will not want for anything." "I am not worried about wanting for things," Elena said. "I am worried about who I am being given to." Iris hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. "He is not what the stories say. I have served in his household for 2 years. I have never once seen him raise his voice to someone weaker than him." Elena studied her for a moment, trying to decide if the words were meant to comfort her, or simply to keep the peace during a long carriage ride. She decided it did not matter either way. She would see for herself soon enough, and no second-hand account, kind or otherwise, was going to change the fact that she was arriving as payment for a war she had never asked to be part of. As the carriage rolled through the final stretch of road leading up to the Cade stronghold, Elena caught her first glimpse of it rising out of the trees, a great fortress of dark stone, sitting high on a ridge that overlooked the entire valley, its windows catching the last light of the afternoon sun like watching eyes. It looked less like a home, and more like a place built to withstand a siege, which, she supposed, was exactly what it was. Her heart was pounding by the time the carriage came to a stop in the wide courtyard. Rows of pack members had gathered, some out of curiosity, some out of duty, all of them watching the door of the carriage the way people watch a stage before the actors appear. Elena took a slow breath, thought once more of Grace's words, and stepped out. The courtyard fell quiet. She did not look at the crowd first. She looked instead at the man standing at the top of the stone steps leading into the fortress, because there was no mistaking who he was. He wore no crown, no ceremonial mark of rank beyond the confidence with which he stood, but every person in that courtyard turned toward him, the way plants turn toward the sun. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a stillness to him that felt less like calm and more like restrained power, the kind of stillness a mountain has right before it decides to move. She met his eyes, ready to hold his gaze the way she had promised herself she would, to prove she was not afraid. But it was Damon Cade who looked away first. Not out of weakness. Elena would understand later that it was the opposite. In that single moment, something in his expression had cracked wide open, shock rippling across features that had clearly not shown open emotion in front of his pack in a very long time. He stared at her as if she were a ghost, or a memory come to life, his hands curling slowly into fists at his sides. Elena did not understand it. She only knew that the man she had been warned to fear was looking at her not with cold command, but with something that looked, impossibly, like disbelief. Whatever it was, it unsettled her more than any cruelty could have. She had prepared herself for a monster. She had not prepared herself for a man who looked at her like she was something he had been waiting his whole life to find, and did not yet understand why. Damon Cade had not expected to feel the ground shift under him in his own courtyard, in front of his entire pack. He had agreed to the marriage for practical reasons. 3 years of war with the Whitmore pack had cost him too many good fighters, too much land, too many nights spent awake calculating losses instead of sleeping. When his advisors suggested a marriage alliance to end the conflict, he had agreed the way he agreed to most difficult decisions, with a clear head and no room for sentiment. He had not asked what the woman looked like. He had not cared. He needed peace for his people, and a wife was a small price to pay for it. Then the carriage door opened, and every calculation in his mind went silent. He knew her face. He had known it for years, though he had never once believed it belonged to a real person. Since he was 16 years old, Damon had dreamed of a woman standing in moonlight, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes holding a steadiness that made him feel, even in sleep, like he was standing in front of someone who could see straight through him. The dream had come to him again and again over the years. Always the same woman. Always the same quiet certainty that she mattered to him in a way he could not explain. He had told no one about it. He had assumed, as he grew older and the dream did not fade, that it was simply his mind's way of holding on to some longing he could not name. Now that woman was standing in his courtyard in a blue traveling dress, sent to him as payment for a war, and she was looking back at him like she expected him to be cruel. He forced his expression back into something steady, before anyone else in the courtyard noticed how badly he had been shaken. Years of leading a pack through war had taught him how to hide what he felt behind a calm exterior, and he called on that skill now, even though his heart was pounding harder than it had in any fight he could remember. "Elena Whitmore," he said, walking down the steps toward her. His voice came out even, formal, the voice he used for pack business. "You are welcome in Cade territory." "Thank you," she said. Her chin was lifted, her shoulders straight, and he could see the effort it took her to hold that posture. He recognized it, because he had done the same thing many times, standing tall when everything in him wanted to do otherwise. He offered his arm, the traditional gesture for welcoming a new pack member of importance, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her hand was cold. He noticed that immediately, the way he noticed everything about her, as if some part of him had been waiting years for permission to pay attention. He led her inside, aware of every eye in the courtyard watching them, aware that his own beta, Owen, was watching him with a raised eyebrow, clearly having noticed the strange stillness that had come over his alpha in front of the entire pack. Once they were inside the main hall, away from the crowd, Damon stopped and turned to face her fully. Up close, the resemblance to the woman from his dreams was even more precise, down to the small scar along her left wrist that he had noticed in dozens of dreams without ever knowing what it meant. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I know this arrangement was not your choice. I do not intend to make your life here harder than it already feels." Elena studied him carefully, as if trying to find the trick in his words. "That is a generous thing to say to someone your pack negotiated to buy." "You were not bought," Damon said, more firmly than he meant to. "You are not property. Whatever agreement was made between our families, you are a person, not a transaction, and I intend to treat you as such." She did not answer right away. He could see her deciding whether to believe him, and he understood why she would not. She had been told her whole life, probably, that the Cade pack was full of monsters. He was not going to convince her otherwise with a single conversation in an entrance hall. "You may take the East Wing chambers," he said instead, choosing not to press the matter further. "They are private, and they have the best view of the mountains. My housekeeper, Bettina, will see to anything you need." "And the marriage?" Elena asked. "When is it expected to happen?" Damon hesitated. He had planned to move quickly, the way any political marriage would, to solidify the treaty and end the uncertainty on both sides of the border. But something in him resisted the idea of rushing this, of taking what fate seemed to have handed him, without giving her any room to breathe first. "There is no need to rush," he said. "The treaty terms are already in place, regardless of the timing of the ceremony. Take whatever time you need to settle in." Elena's eyebrows drew together slightly, clear confusion crossing her face. It was obvious this was not the answer she had expected. "You do not want to marry quickly? I thought that was the entire purpose of my being here." "The purpose of your being here was to end a war that has cost both our packs too much," Damon said. "That does not mean I have to be careless with how it happens." She said nothing for a long moment, studying him with an expression he could not quite read, somewhere between suspicion and something softer she did not seem willing to show yet. "Thank you," she finally said, quiet and a little uncertain, as though she did not entirely trust the kindness, but did not know what else to do with it. Damon nodded and stepped back, giving her the space he sensed she needed. He watched as a young woman, one of his household staff, came forward to guide Elena toward the East Wing, and he stood there in the main hall, long after she had disappeared up the stairs, his mind circling back again and again, to the dream that had haunted him for years, now standing in his home, in the shape of a real woman, who did not yet know any of it. That night, Damon sat alone in his study, long after the household had gone quiet, staring at nothing in particular. Owen found him there, leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed. "You want to tell me what happened out there today?" Owen asked. "You looked like you had seen a ghost." Damon considered how much to say. Owen was the one person in his pack he trusted completely, the person who had stood beside him since they were boys training together. long before either of them imagined Damon would become alpha at 22 after his father's death. If there was anyone he could tell about the dream, it was Owen. "I have been dreaming about a woman since I was 16, Damon said finally. "The same woman, over and over, for years. I never told anyone because I did not understand it, and I did not think it mattered." Owen's expression shifted from curiosity to something more careful. "And Elena Whitmore is that woman?" "Yes." Owen was quiet for a moment, processing that. "That is either the most convenient coincidence I have ever heard of, or it is not a coincidence at all." "I know," Damon said. "I do not know what it means yet, but I am not going to force anything on her because of it. She already believes she was sent here as a prize to be claimed. I will not confirm that fear by pushing this on her before she is ready to hear it." Owen studied his friend for a long moment, something like respect settling into his expression. "You have more restraint than I would have in your position." "I have had years to learn restraint," Damon said quietly. "War teaches you that, if nothing else." Owen left him to his thoughts not long after, and Damon sat alone in the study, the fire burning low, thinking about the woman sleeping now somewhere in the east wing of his home, unaware that she had been the center of his private thoughts for the better part of a decade. He did not know what fate intended by bringing her to him this way, wrapped in the bitterness of a forced arrangement instead of anything resembling choice. But he knew, with a certainty, that unsettled him more than anything in his years of leading a pack through war, that he was not going to let her go now that she was here. He would simply have to be patient enough to earn what fate had already decided. The first week in Cade territory passed slower than any week Elena could remember. She woke each morning in a room larger than her entire chamber back home, with tall windows that looked out over mountains capped in early snow, and each morning she reminded herself where she was and why. It was easy, in the quiet moments right after waking, to forget the circumstances that had brought her here. It was harder to forget once she was fully awake and the weight of it settled back onto her shoulders. Bettina, the housekeeper Damon had mentioned, turned out to be a warm, sturdy woman in her 50s, who treated Elena less like a political hostage and more like a guest who needed fattening up and looking after. She brought extra blankets without being asked, learned within 2 days that Elena preferred her tea without honey, and never once made Elena feel like an outsider in the house, even when Elena herself felt exactly like one. "You are not eating enough," Bettina told her on the 4th morning, setting down a tray heavy with bread and fruit and roasted meat. "A woman needs her strength, especially in a new place." "I am not very hungry," Elena admitted. "Grief does that," Bettina said simply, and did not push further, though the word grief sat with Elena for the rest of the day, because it was the first time anyone in this household had named what she was feeling, without dressing it up as something else. She saw little of Damon during that first week. He sent word each morning, asking if she needed anything, always through Bettina or one of the household staff, never in person. At first Elena assumed this was simple indifference, a man too occupied with running a territory to concern himself with the woman sent to marry him. But by the 3rd day, she began to suspect it was something else entirely. He was giving her room, deliberately, the way a person gives room to an animal they do not want to frighten off. She did not know what to make of that kindness. It sat uneasily against everything she had heard about him before arriving, the stories of a merciless alpha who had crushed every threat to his territory without hesitation. Those stories, and the quiet, careful man she had spoken to in the entrance hall, did not seem to belong to the same person. On the 5th day, she finally saw him properly again, not through a message delivered by staff, but in person, in the gardens behind the main house. She had gone out for air, tired of the 4 walls of her chamber, and found him standing near a stone fountain, speaking quietly with an older man she did not recognize. When Damon noticed her, he ended the conversation and crossed the garden toward her. "Elena," he said. "I hope the accommodations have been comfortable." "They have," she said. "Bettina has been very kind. She tends to adopt anyone who stays under this roof for more than 3 days," Damon said, and there was the faintest trace of warmth in his voice, something almost like humor, that surprised her. "You should expect to be fed constantly for the rest of your stay." Despite herself, Elena felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. It was the first time since arriving that she had felt anything close to lightness. "I will keep that in mind." They walked together for a while after that, an unplanned, easy pace along the garden paths, and Elena found herself talking more than she had intended, telling him about her mother's garden back home, about the way her mother used to grow herbs along the kitchen windows before she died. Damon listened without interrupting, without offering the kind of hollow sympathy people sometimes gave when they did not know what else to say. He simply listened, and asked a question here and there that showed he had actually been paying attention. "You loved her very much," he said, when Elena finished. "I did," Elena said. "I still do. I think about her every day, even now, especially now." She stopped herself before she said more, surprised at how easily the words had come, surprised that she had let this stranger, this man she was meant to marry, out of political necessity, see something so private. "I am sorry you lost her," Damon said, "and I am sorry that you did not have a say in what happened to you afterward, with your brother's decision." Elena looked at him carefully. "You keep saying things like that you are sorry for what happened to me. You are the reason it happened." "I am the reason the treaty exists," Damon said, meeting her eyes without flinching from the accusation. "I did not ask for you to be given without your consent. I did not know the terms would be decided without your voice in the matter until you told me yourself, days after the fact. If I had known, I would have insisted your brothers include you in the discussion from the start." "Would that have changed anything?" Elena asked. "The treaty still needed to happen. I still would have ended up here, one way or another." "Perhaps," Damon said, "but you would have arrived knowing you had been asked, instead of arriving knowing you had been handed over. Those are not the same thing, even if the outcome looks identical from the outside." Elena had no answer for that. It was, she realized, exactly the distinction that had been eating at her since the night her brothers announced the arrangement. Not the marriage itself, not even the politics behind it, but the absence of her own voice in a decision that reshaped her entire life. Damon had understood that without her needing to explain it, and something about being understood so precisely, by a man she had expected to be cold and unmoved by her feelings entirely, cracked something open in her chest that she was not prepared for. They continued walking in silence for a while, and Elena found, strangely, that the silence was comfortable rather than tense. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Of course. That first day, in the courtyard, you looked at me like you recognized me. Like you had seen me somewhere before. What was that?" Damon's steps slowed. For a moment, she thought he might deflect the question, might give her some vague answer that avoided the truth. Instead, he stopped walking altogether and turned to face her, his expression unusually open. "I did not want to tell you yet," he admitted. "I was not certain how to explain it without sounding either mad or manipulative, but since you asked directly, I will not lie to you." "Then tell me," Elena said. "I have dreamed of a woman since I was 16 years old," Damon said. "The same woman, appearing again and again over the years, always in moonlight, always with the same face. I never understood what the dream meant. I assumed it was simply my mind, creating something I longed for, but did not have a name for." He paused. "When you stepped out of that carriage, I realized the woman from my dreams has your face, down to the scar on your wrist. I have never told anyone that outside of my closest friend, until now." Elena stood very still, absorbing what he had said. Part of her wanted to dismiss it immediately, to call it exactly the kind of manipulative story a man might invent to win the trust of a woman he had been handed as a political prize. But there was something in the way he said it, careful and almost reluctant, as if he would have preferred not to tell her at all, that made dismissal harder than she expected. "That is a strange thing to hear," she said finally, because it was the most honest response she could manage. "I know," Damon said. "I do not expect you to believe it right away, or perhaps ever. I only wanted you to have the truth, since you asked for it." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deceit, any flicker that would tell her this was simply a clever performance, designed to make her more compliant. She found none. What she found instead was a man who looked almost as unsettled by his own confession as she felt hearing it. "I do not know what to do with that," she admitted. "You do not have to do anything with it," Damon said gently. "I am not asking you to believe in fate, or dreams, or anything else. I am only asking you to know the truth of why I looked at you the way I did that first day. Nothing more." They stood together in the quiet garden, the mountain air cool around them, And for the first time since arriving in Cade territory, Elena felt something other than fear or resentment settle into the space where those feelings had been living since the night her brothers announced her fate. She did not know what to call the feeling yet. She only knew it was there, small and uncertain, and that it had not existed in her before this conversation. And word of the dream did not stay contained to the garden conversation. Within days, whispers moved through the household staff, the kind of quiet talk that spreads in any large home where people notice more than they say out loud. Bettina mentioned it first, carefully, while helping Elena arrange her hair one morning. "The Alpha has never told anyone about that dream," Bettina said. "Not in all the years I have worked in this house. Whatever passed between you two in that garden, it meant something to him." "How do you know he told me anything at all?" Elena asked, startled. Bettina gave her a knowing look through the mirror. "Because he has been different since. Lighter, somehow, though he tries to hide it, and you have been asking fewer questions about when you might be sent home." Elena did not have a response to that, mostly because it was true. She had stopped, somewhere in the last several days, mentally counting how long it might be before she could return to her old life. She was not sure when that shift had happened, only that it had. Her days took on a gentle rhythm after that. She began joining Damon for meals, not every day, but often enough that it stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like something closer to normal. He asked about her life before the war, about the small details of her days at the Whitmore territory, and she found that she wanted to tell him, wanted him to understand who she had been before she became a bargaining chip in a peace treaty. In turn, she learned things about him that the stories back home had never mentioned. She learned that he had taken over leadership of his pack at 22, after his father was killed defending a border patrol, and that the weight of that sudden responsibility had shaped nearly every decision he had made since. She learned that he rarely slept more than a few hours a night, that he carried the losses of the war more personally than his composed exterior let on, that he blamed himself for every fighter lost on both sides of the conflict, hers and his own. "You cannot carry every death like it is your fault," she told him one evening, as they sat by the fire in his study, a place she had started visiting more often as the weeks passed. "Who else should carry it?" Damon asked. "I am the one who chose to keep fighting, instead of finding another way sooner." "And now, you have found another way," Elena said. "You are trying to end it. That should count for something." "It should," he agreed. "It does not always feel like it does." She understood that feeling more than she expected to. She thought of her own brothers, of the guilt she suspected lived somewhere under Gareth's stern exterior, even if he had never once shown it to her directly. Leadership, she was beginning to understand, asked people to carry weight that never fully set them down, no matter how well things turned out in the end. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into her stay, Damon surprised her by asking if she would like to see more of the territory beyond the fortress walls. He arranged for horses, and they rode out together in the late afternoon, following a trail that wound down through the forest toward a wide, clear lake that sat like a mirror beneath the mountains. "This is beautiful," Elena said, dismounting near the water's edge. The light was turning gold with the approaching sunset, catching on the surface of the lake in a way that made the whole scene look almost unreal. "My mother used to bring me here when I was young," Damon said, coming to stand beside her, before she passed. "It was the one place my father let her take me away from pack business, even for just an afternoon." "You do not talk about her often," Elena observed. "I do not talk about much of my past with most people," Damon admitted. "It has been easier since becoming Alpha to keep those parts of myself separate from the responsibilities I carry every day. Leaders are not meant to seem soft." "I do not think showing you have a past makes you soft," Elena said. "I think it makes you someone your people can trust, because they know there is a real person underneath the title." Damon looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You say things that make me reconsider decisions I made a long time ago, about how to lead." "Is that a bad thing?" "No," he said quietly. "I do not think it is." They stood together at the edge of the lake as the sun sank lower, and Elena found herself acutely aware of how close he stood, of the warmth radiating from him against the cooling evening air. She had spent the first weeks of her time in Cade territory, bracing herself for cruelty that never came, and somewhere in the space left by that absence, something else had begun quietly growing instead. "I owe you an apology," she said suddenly. Damon turned to look at her, surprised. For what? I arrived here expecting a monster, Elena said. I built an entire version of you in my mind, before I ever met you, based on stories from people who had every reason to see your pack as the enemy during a war. I judged you before I gave you the chance to be anything other than what I expected. You had every reason to be wary, Damon said. You arrived here without any say in the matter, sent to marry a man you had never met, from a pack your people had been fighting for years. Caution was the only sensible response. Maybe, Elena said, but I do not think you are what those stories described. I do not think you ever were. Something shifted in Damon's expression, a softness she had rarely seen from him breaking fully through his usual composure. I have spent 3 years trying to end this war without losing more of my people than necessary. I have made hard choices I am not proud of, choices that probably fed some of those stories, but I have never once wanted to be the kind of leader who rules through fear alone. I believe that, Elena said, and she realized, as the words left her, that she meant them completely. They rode back to the fortress as the last light faded from the sky, and for the first time since arriving in Cade territory, Elena did not feel like a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control. She felt, instead, like someone slowly discovering that the life she had been forced into might not be the punishment she had once believed it to be. That night, lying awake in her chamber, she thought about the dream Damon had described, about a woman appearing to him in moonlight for years, before she ever arrived in his territory. She still did not know what to make of it, whether it was truly some sign from fate, or simply an unusual coincidence given weight by circumstance. But she found, for the first time, that she was no longer dismissing the possibility outright. Something had shifted inside her over these past weeks, something she was not yet ready to name, but could no longer pretend she did not feel. A letter arrived from home in the 6th week, carried by one of the Whitmore pack's messengers, and Elena's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. It was from Colin, her younger brother, and his handwriting was less steady than usual, as though he had written it in a hurry, or with a heavy heart, or both. He wrote that the harvest had been thin that year, thinner than expected even accounting for the years of war, and that without the resources the treaty had promised, several families in their territory were struggling to prepare for the coming winter. He did not ask her for anything directly. He simply told her the truth of how things stood, as if he needed someone to know, even from a distance. Elena read the letter twice, then sat with it in her lap for a long while, staring out at the mountains beyond her window. She found Damon later that evening in his study, where she had taken to spending part of her evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence while he worked through pack business. She handed him the letter without a word, and watched his face as he read it. Your brothers are proud men, Damon said, once he finished. It would have cost Colin something to write this, even without asking for help directly. They chased peace for the pack, Elena said, and now the pack is struggling anyway, even with the treaty in place. The treaty ended the fighting, Damon said carefully. It did not undo 3 years of losses in a single season. That takes longer to recover from than any of us would like. Elena nodded, though the ache in her chest did not ease. I know you cannot fix everything with a treaty. I am not asking you to. I know you are not, Damon said, but I can still choose to help, if you are willing to let me. She looked up at him, surprised. You would send aid to my brothers, after everything? The treaty was meant to end suffering on both sides of the border, not just secure land for the Cade pack, Damon said. If your people are struggling to prepare for winter, that is not a problem I am willing to ignore, simply because our territories used to be at war. Sending grain and supplies now is not weakness. It is exactly the kind of goodwill that turns a fragile treaty into something that actually lasts. Elena felt something tighten in her throat, gratitude mixed with something more complicated, something that had been building steadily over the past weeks without her fully naming it. Thank you, she said quietly. I did not expect this from you. Even after everything you have already shown me, I still find myself surprised by your kindness. You do not have to keep being surprised by it, Damon said. I would like it, eventually, if you simply expected it from me. The words settled between them, quiet but weighted, and Elena understood he was not only talking about grain shipments or treaty terms. She held his gaze for a long moment, feeling the careful distance she had maintained since arriving begin, gradually, to soften. Over the following days, Damon arranged for supplies to be sent to the Whitmore territory. Wagons loaded with grain and preserved meat and warm blankets, enough to see struggling families through the harsh months ahead. He did not make a show of it, did not send it with any demand for gratitude or acknowledgement. He simply did it, quietly, because Elena had shown him a letter that troubled her, and that had been enough. Elena found herself watching him differently after that, noticing small things she had overlooked before. The way he listened fully when his advisors spoke, never dismissing a concern, even when he disagreed with it. The way he greeted every member of his household staff by name, asking after their families as though he genuinely wanted to know the answer. The way he carried himself with quiet authority that never once tipped into cruelty, even when frustration crossed his face during difficult pack meetings. None of it matched the stories she had grown up hearing about the Cade Pack's Alpha King. All of it matched the man she was slowly coming to know. One afternoon, walking through the fortress gardens together, Elena found herself asking a question she had been holding back for weeks. "Do you regret it?" she asked, "agreeing to this marriage? Before you knew about the dream, before any of this, when it was still just a political arrangement to end a war?" Damon considered the question seriously before answering. "I did not know, at the time, what I would find on the other side of that agreement. I only knew ending the war mattered more than my own comfort with the terms. So no, I do not regret agreeing to it. I only regret that it cost you your own voice in the decision." "And now?" Elena pressed. "Now that you know what you found on the other side of it." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression open in a way she had come to recognize as rare and deliberate, a choice he made only around her. "Now I understand why fate showed me your face for 10 years before I ever met you. I do not believe in coincidence, Elena. I believe you were meant to find your way to me, even if the path here was harder than either of us would have chosen." Elena's breath caught slightly at the certainty in his voice. She thought of the woman she had been when she stepped out of that carriage weeks ago, braced for cruelty, determined to show no weakness to a man she had been taught to fear. That woman felt distant now, replaced by someone who found herself, more and more, looking forward to the quiet hours spent in this man's company. "I am still afraid," she admitted quietly, "not of you, of how quickly all of this is changing, of how much I have started to feel, in a place I never chose to be." "You do not have to rush any of it," Damon said gently. "I told you that the first day you arrived, and I meant it. Whatever grows between us, it should grow because you choose it, not because circumstance forced it upon you." "And if I do choose it?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eventually, when I am ready." Damon's expression softened into something that looked almost like hope, carefully guarded, but unmistakably real. "Then I will consider myself the most fortunate alpha in the history of this territory." Elena laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her by the warmth in his voice, and the sound of it seemed to catch Damon off guard too, his own smile breaking through in response, unguarded for just a moment. It was the first time she had heard herself laugh freely since arriving in Cade territory, and something about that small, ordinary moment felt like the clearest sign yet that her life here was becoming something other than the punishment she had once feared it would be. Not everyone in Cade territory welcomed the change in their alpha with open arms. Elena noticed it first in small ways, glances from certain members of the pack council that lingered a little too long, conversations that quieted when she entered a room she was not expected to enter. She mentioned it to Bettina one afternoon, trying to keep her tone light even though the unease had been building for days. "There are some who do not trust the treaty," Bettina admitted, setting down the linen she had been folding. "Not because of you specifically, dear, but because trust takes longer to rebuild than a single agreement can manage. Some of the older council members lost sons and brothers in the fighting. It is hard for grief to let go of suspicion, even when the reasons for that suspicion no longer apply." "Does Damon know?" Elena asked. "He knows everything that happens under his roof," Bettina said. "He simply does not always share the weight of it with others. That has always been his way." Elena thought about that conversation for days afterward, turning it over in her mind whenever she caught another wary glance from a council member, or overheard hushed voices that stopped the moment she came near. She had grown so absorbed in her own changing feelings toward Damon that she had almost forgotten the political weight still resting on her presence in this territory. She was not simply a woman falling slowly, cautiously in love with a man she had once feared. She was also a living symbol of a treaty that some in this pack still viewed with suspicion, a walking reminder of the war that had cost them so much. She raised the subject with Damon that evening, unwilling to let it sit unspoken between them any longer. "There are members of your council who do not trust me," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "I have seen it in the way they look at me." Damon's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained even. "There are members of my council who do not trust anything that changed too quickly, myself included in their eyes at times. Grief makes people cling to old certainties, even ones that no longer serve them well." "Should I be worried?" Elena asked. "No," Damon said firmly. "You are under my protection, and that protection is absolute. But I will not pretend the tension does not exist. It would be dishonest to tell you otherwise." "I would rather know the truth," Elena said. "Even the difficult parts." Anne reached across the small distance between them and took her hand, a simple gesture that had become more natural between them in recent weeks. "I promise you honesty. Always. That is something I can control, even when I cannot control how quickly old wounds heal." Elena appreciated the honesty, even as it left her with a low current of worry that followed her through the following days. She began paying closer attention during pack gatherings, trying to identify which council members held the most resistance to the treaty, trying to understand whether there was anything she could do to ease the tension that still lingered beneath the surface of her new life. She found an unlikely ally in Owen, Damon's beta and closest friend, who sought her out one afternoon while she was walking alone in the gardens. "You have been watching the council meetings more closely," Owen observed, falling into step beside her. "I have noticed." "Is it that obvious?" Elena asked. "Only to someone paying attention," Owen said. "Which I am, because Damon asked me to keep an eye on things after the last council meeting grew tense over the grain shipments he sent to your brother's territory." Elena's stomach tightened. "The grain shipments caused tension?" Some of the older council members felt it was too generous, too soon, given how recently the fighting ended, Owen explained. "They worry it signals weakness to other neighboring packs, who might be watching how the Cade territory handles the aftermath of war." "And what do you think?" Elena asked. Owen considered the question seriously before answering. "I think Damon has led this pack through 3 years of war, without losing sight of who he wants to be once the fighting stops. That matters more than a handful of council members clinging to old suspicions. Give it time, Elena. Trust rebuilds slowly. But it does rebuild, especially when people see consistent proof that things have actually changed." His words offered some comfort, though the underlying worry did not fully disappear. Elena found herself more determined after that conversation to prove, through her own actions, that she was not simply a political pawn passing through Cade territory, but someone genuinely invested in the well-being of this pack, war history and all. She began spending time in the village nearest the fortress, first accompanying Bettina on errands, then eventually on her own, getting to know families she had never expected to interact with when she first arrived. She helped at a small clinic run by an older healer named Margaret, learning enough about herb preparation and wound care to make herself genuinely useful, rather than simply decorative. She listened to stories from villagers who had lost family members in the war, offering what comfort she could, without pretending to fully understand losses that were not her own. Word of her efforts reached the council slowly, the way such things always do, filtering through conversations and second-hand accounts, until even the most resistant members began to notice that the woman brought to their territory as a treaty condition was choosing, of her own will, to invest in their community's well-being. Damon noticed the change too, watching from a careful distance as Elena built her own place in his territory, rather than simply accepting the place that had been assigned to her. "You did not have to do any of this," he told her one evening, after she returned from another long afternoon at Margaret's clinic. "The treaty terms did not require you to prove yourself to anyone." "I know," Elena said, settling into the chair across from his desk, tired but satisfied in a way she had not expected to feel. "I am not doing it for the treaty terms. I am doing it because I have started to care about this place, and the people in it, for their own sake." Damon studied her for a long moment, something warm and unmistakable in his expression. "You continue to surprise me, Elena Whitmore." "Good," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I would hate to become predictable." He laughed then, a rare, unguarded sound that Elena had grown to treasure more than she expected to, each time she managed to draw it out of him. Whatever tension still lingered among certain members of his council, whatever old wounds had not yet fully healed, Elena found herself increasingly certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be, building a life she had never chosen but had come, slowly and honestly, to want with her whole heart. The messenger arrived just after midnight, exhausted and breathless, with news that shattered the peaceful rhythm Elena had grown accustomed to over the past 2 months. A group opposing the new treaty, remnants of a faction that had profited from the long war and stood to lose from its end, had struck a patrol along the northern border, the very stretch of land that had been folded into Elena's dowry as part of the agreement between the two packs. Damon was already dressed and moving before Elena fully understood what was happening, pulling on his coat while giving rapid instructions to Owen and 2 other senior pack members who had been summoned along with him. "Stay here," Damon told her, pausing only long enough to press a brief, urgent kiss to her forehead. "Bettina will keep the doors secured. I will send word as soon as I know more." "Damon," Elena started, fear rising sharply in her chest. "I will come back," he said, holding her gaze with a steadiness that was meant to reassure her, though she could see the tension underneath it. "I promise you that." Then he was gone, moving out into the dark with Owen and the others, and Elena was left standing in the cold entrance hall, with nothing to do but wait. The hours that followed were the longest of her life. She paced the length of her chamber, then the hallway outside it, then finally gave up on stillness altogether and went to sit with Bettina in the kitchen, needing company more than she needed solitude. Bettina made tea neither of them drank, and told stories about Damon as a boy, about the years before he became alpha, trying to keep Elena's mind occupied with something other than fear. It did not work particularly well, but Elena appreciated the effort more than she could say. Word finally came near dawn, carried by a young pack member who arrived at the fortress with dirt on his clothes and exhaustion written across his face. The attack had been contained, the border patrol reinforced in time to prevent any lasting damage to the territory, but not before several fighters on both sides had been hurt in the confrontation. Damon himself had been wounded, though the messenger assured Elena it was not life-threatening, before he was rushed away to help coordinate the remaining response. Elena did not wait for further updates. She had a horse saddled within minutes, ignoring Bettina's protests that it was not safe for her to ride out alone, and made her way toward the border herself, following directions given hastily by the exhausted messenger. She found Damon in a makeshift camp near the border, sitting on an overturned crate while a healer wrapped a wound along his upper arm, his face pale but his composure largely intact despite the visible strain of the night's events. He looked up when she approached, surprise flickering across his features. "You should not have ridden out here alone," he said, though there was no real reprimand in his voice, only concern. "You promised you would come back," Elena said, her voice shaking despite her best effort to keep it steady. "I needed to see that for myself." "I am here," Damon said gently, a little worse for the encounter, but here. Elena knelt beside him, taking in the wound the healer was finishing bandaging, the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Something in her chest, something she had been carefully guarding for weeks, cracked wide open at the sight of him hurt, at the very real possibility that the night could have ended so much worse. "I was so afraid," she admitted quietly, her hand finding his uninjured one and holding tight. "I sat in that fortress waiting for news, and I realized I could not imagine what I would do if something happened to you." Damon's expression softened, exhaustion giving way to something warmer despite the circumstances. "Elena, I think I have known for a while," she continued, the words spilling out now that she had started, unwilling to hold them back any longer, given how close the night had come to taking that choice from her entirely. "I have been careful, telling myself I needed more time, that I was not ready to trust what I was feeling. But sitting in that kitchen tonight, not knowing if you would come back, I understood exactly what I feel for you. I was simply too afraid to say it out loud." "And now?" Damon asked, his voice quiet, careful, as though he did not dare hope too openly for the answer he wanted. "Now I do not want to waste any more time being afraid," Elena said. "I love you, Damon, not because of the dream, not because of the treaty, but because of who you have shown yourself to be, every single day since I arrived here." Damon's uninjured hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing gently across her cheek. "I have loved you since long before you knew my name," he said softly. "But hearing you say it, knowing you have arrived at this on your own, without any pressure from fate or dreams or anything else, means more to me than you could possibly know." Around them, the camp continued its quiet work of tending wounds and securing the border, but for one long moment, Elena felt entirely wrapped up in the man in front of her, in the relief of his safety, and the honesty of feelings she had finally allowed herself to voice. She leaned forward and pressed a careful kiss to his lips, mindful of his injury, but unwilling to wait any longer to close the distance that fear had kept between them for so many weeks. When they finally pulled apart, Damon was smiling despite the pain visible in his eyes, a smile that reached all the way to the exhaustion lining his face, and softened it into something like pure happiness. "We should get you back to the fortress," Elena said, forcing herself to focus on practical matters, despite the emotion still swelling in her chest. "You need proper rest, not a crate in a border camp." "I would argue," Damon said, "but I think you are right, for once." She helped him to his feet, steadying him as they made their way toward the horses, Owen falling into step beside them, with a knowing look that told Elena he had likely overheard at least part of their conversation. He said nothing about it, only offered a small, approving nod, before turning his attention to organizing the remaining pack members for the ride back. The journey back to the fortress was slower than Elena's ride out had been, careful and measured to accommodate Damon's injury, but she found she did not mind the extra time. She rode close beside him the entire way, unwilling to put any distance between them, after a night that had shown her, more clearly than any dream or careful courtship could have, exactly how much this man had come to mean to her. Damon's recovery took nearly 2 weeks, during which Elena barely left his side, splitting her time between his study, where he insisted on continuing pack business despite his injury, and his private chambers, where she made sure he actually rested when the healers required it. It was during this quiet stretch of recovery that Elena found the letter that would upend everything she thought she understood about her family's decision to send her away. She had gone looking for a book Damon mentioned in his study, something about the early history of the territory that she had expressed curiosity about during one of their long conversations, and in searching through a stack of papers on his desk, she came across correspondence that had nothing to do with the book at all. It was a letter from her brother Gareth, addressed to Damon, dated from before her arrival months ago, discussing the final terms of the treaty in detail neither of them had ever explained to her directly. She should have stopped reading. She knew that even as her eyes moved across the page, but something about the careful, businesslike language stopped her, made her keep going, despite the growing unease building in her chest. The letter did not simply discuss ending the war and securing peace. It discussed compensation, additional land grants and trade agreements extended to the Whitmore pack beyond what Elena had ever been told, terms that made her marriage look less like a necessary sacrifice for peace and more like a carefully negotiated transaction that had profited her brothers considerably, beyond simply ending the fighting. Elena set the letter down with trembling hands, feeling something cold settle over her that she had not felt since the very first days of her arrival. She did not confront Damon immediately. She could not with him still recovering, not with the raw vulnerability of their recent confession still so fresh between them. Instead, she carried the weight of what she had learned alone for 2 days, turning it over in her mind, trying to understand how much of what she had believed about her family's decision had been softened for her benefit, and how much Damon himself had known and chosen not to share. On the 3rd day, unable to carry the silence any longer, she brought the letter to him. Damon read it slowly, his expression growing careful and measured in a way that told Elena he had, in fact, known about its contents all along. When he finished, he set it down and met her eyes directly, no attempt at deflection in his posture. "You knew about this," Elena said. It was not a question. "Yes," Damon admitted. "I knew the full terms of the treaty from the beginning. I did not share the details with you because they were not mine to share. That was information your brothers should have given you themselves. They let me believe this was purely about survival," Elena said, her voice tight, with a hurt she had not expected to feel so sharply, given everything else that had already changed in her life, about ending the war before more people died. "They never mentioned land grants, or trade agreements, or anything that suggests they benefited financially from handing me over. The war was real, Damon said carefully. The losses were real. I do not believe your brothers invented those reasons to disguise a purely selfish transaction. But I also will not pretend the treaty did not include terms that benefited them beyond simply ending the fighting. Both things can be true at once. Elena sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk, the weight of the realization settling fully now that she had spoken it aloud. I forgave them, in my own way, because I told myself they did this out of desperation, out of a genuine need to protect our people. Finding out there was more to it than that they profited, while never telling me the full truth, makes it feel different somehow. Smaller, less noble than I let myself believe. Your feelings are not wrong for shifting, Damon said gently. You are allowed to hold complicated feelings about people you love, even when they have hurt you. Loving your brothers does not require you to pretend they made a purely selfless choice, when the truth is more complicated than that. Elena looked up at him, something in his steady, honest tone settling some of the turmoil in her chest. You could have told me from the beginning. You could have let me arrive here already knowing the full truth, instead of letting me discover it on my own months later. I could have, Damon agreed. I chose not to, because I did not think it was my place to reveal your own family's private dealings to you. I regret now that my silence caused you pain, even if I still believe the choice itself was the right one to make. His honesty, even in admitting a decision that had ultimately hurt her, struck Elena more deeply than any excuse or deflection could have. He had not lied to her. He had simply respected a boundary that, in hindsight, might not have needed respecting, and he was willing to own that mistake without making excuses for it. You have never once lied to me, Elena said slowly, realization settling over her. Not once, in all these months. Even when the truth was complicated, even when it might have been easier to soften things for your own benefit, you have always been honest with me. I promised you that from the beginning, Damon said. I intend to keep that promise for as long as you will have me. Elena rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat, settling carefully beside him, mindful of his still healing injury. I think that is the difference, she said quietly, between what my brothers did and what you have done. They decided things for me, and hoped I would never learn the full truth. You have given me honesty, even when it cost you my trust temporarily to do it. I would rather have your trust built on truth, Damon said, even if that truth is sometimes difficult, than have you trust me based on comfortable lies that fall apart the moment you learn more. Elena leaned into him, resting her head carefully against his shoulder, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsteady since she first read that letter days earlier. She would need to write to her brothers eventually, would need to have a difficult conversation about what she had learned and how it had changed the way she viewed their decision. But that conversation could wait a little longer. For now, she simply wanted to sit beside the one person in this entire situation who had never once given her reason to doubt his honesty, and let that certainty be enough. The Pack Council grew louder in their demands, as autumn deepened into winter, pressing Damon with increasing urgency to formalize the marriage bond and secure the treaty beyond any doubt. The recent attack on the border had rattled even the members who once supported the peace agreement wholeheartedly, and many now believed that a completed marriage, sealed through the full mate bond, would send an unmistakable message to any remaining opposition that the alliance between the two packs was permanent and unshakable. Elena heard about the growing pressure secondhand at first, through careful comments from Bettina and pointed observations from Owen, before Damon finally addressed it with her directly one evening in his study. The council wants the bond formalized before winter fully sets in, he told her, his tone carefully neutral, in a way that told Elena he was working hard not to influence her decision either direction. They believe it will strengthen the treaty's standing, particularly after the attack showed how much resistance still exists. And what do you want? Elena asked. I want you to choose this because you want it, Damon said simply. Not because a council of anxious advisors believes it is politically necessary. I have told them as much, more than once, and I will continue telling them that for as long as it takes. Even if it puts you in a difficult position with your own council? Elena asked. Especially then, Damon said. I did not spend months giving you space to make your own choices, only to abandon that principle the moment it becomes politically inconvenient. You deserve better than that, and frankly, so do I. I do not want a marriage forged out of pressure. I want one forged out of genuine choice, yours and mine both. Elena studied him carefully, moved by the conviction in his voice, by the fact that even now, under real pressure from the people whose trust and support he needed most, he refused to compromise on the promise of patience he had made to her from the very first day. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of integrity that had drawn her to him in the first place, long before she had let herself acknowledge the depth of what she felt. She thought about the months since her arrival, about the fear and resentment she had carried into this territory, about the slow, careful unraveling of every assumption she had made about the man she was told to see as an enemy. She thought about the dream he had described to her that first week, about moonlight and recognition, and a decade of longing for someone he had not yet met. She thought about the wound on his arm, still healing, earned defending land that had become hers as much as his. She thought about the honesty he had shown her even when it would have been easier to soften the truth, and the patience he continued to show her even now, with an entire council pressing him toward a different choice. She did not need more time to know what she wanted. She had simply needed the courage to say it, without any external pressure clouding whether the choice was truly her own. "I want to formalize the bond," Elena said quietly. "Not because your council demands it, and not because it would strengthen the treaty. I want it because I have fallen in love with you, Damon, completely, and without any doubt left in my heart, and I do not want to wait any longer to make that official between us." Damon went very still, searching her face, as if to be certain she meant every word, before allowing himself to fully believe it. "Elena, you do not need to decide this simply because I told you the council is pressing the matter. I meant what I said. I want this decision entirely free of that pressure." "I know," Elena said, reaching for his hand. "That is exactly why I am telling you now, while the pressure is at its strongest, so you know without any doubt that my answer has nothing to do with it. I would have arrived at this same choice eventually, council or no council. You have simply given me the courage to stop waiting." Slowly, understanding settled into his expression, followed by a warmth that transformed his entire face, softening the careful composure he wore so consistently in front of others. "Then I accept your choice, with more gratitude than I know how to properly express," he said. "And I promise you, for as long as I live, that I will spend every day proving myself worthy of it." They were married 3 weeks later, in a ceremony that blended traditions from both packs, held in the same gardens where Elena had first learned about the dream that had haunted Damon for a decade. Her brothers attended, Gareth and Colin both, and though the conversation between Elena and Gareth about the fuller truth of the treaty terms had been difficult in the weeks leading up to the wedding, some measure of understanding had been reached between them, imperfect but genuine, the kind of reconciliation that acknowledged past mistakes, without demanding they be fully forgotten. Standing before the gathered members of both packs, Elena felt none of the fear that had gripped her the day she first arrived in this territory. She felt, instead, a settled certainty she had not expected to find in a marriage that began as a political transaction between families, still recovering from years of war. When the final vows were spoken and the mate bond formed between them, Elena felt something shift deep within her, a connection more profound than anything words could have prepared her for, a certainty that this man, whom fate had shown her in dreams for a decade before they ever met in waking life, was exactly where she was always meant to end up, regardless of the painful path that had brought her here. Damon pulled her close, as the gathered crowd erupted into celebration around them, his forehead resting against hers, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "10 years of dreaming about you," he murmured, "and none of it compares to actually having you here, choosing me, exactly as you are." "I think," Elena said, smiling against him, "that the waiting made this mean more than it ever could have otherwise." Around them, both packs celebrated together for the first time in living memory, old wounds beginning the slow work of healing beneath the warmth of a union that had started as an arrangement of necessity and grown, against every expectation, into something neither of them would ever have chosen to trade for an easier beginning. Spring arrived early that year, warming the mountains around Cade territory sooner than usual, and with it came a season of change Elena had never imagined for herself, the day she stepped out of a carriage, as a stranger sent to fulfill her brother's bargain. She had grown into her role as Alpha Queen steadily over the winter months, not through grand gestures or forced authority, but through the same quiet consistency that had first won her the trust of the villagers near the fortress. She continued her work at Margaret's clinic whenever her other responsibilities allowed, and expanded it further, establishing a second clinic near the border to serve families who had been hardest hit by the years of fighting. The council members who had once regarded her with suspicion now sought her counsel directly on matters affecting both packs, having watched her prove, season after season, that her commitment to their people ran far deeper than the political necessity that had first brought her here. Her relationship with her brothers healed slowly, in the imperfect way most difficult reconciliations do. Gareth visited twice that spring, and though the early tension over the treaty's fuller terms never fully disappeared, something like understanding had grown between them, built on honest conversation, rather than the careful avoidance that had characterized their relationship in the months right after her arrival. Colin wrote often, his letters warmer now, filled with news of the Whitmore territory's slow recovery, aided in no small part by the continued support Damon provided, not out of obligation, but because he had come to see the Whitmore pack's well-being as tied to his own family's future. "You set new terms with them," Damon observed one evening, as they sat together on the balcony outside their chambers, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become as much home to Elena now as the fields of her childhood once were. "I noticed you have not let them make decisions about your life without your voice, not since that first letter changed things between you." "I learned that lesson the hard way," Elena said. "I do not intend to forget it. They know now that any future dealings between our families include me as an equal participant, not simply someone to be informed after decisions are already made." "Good," Damon said, pulling her closer against his side. "You deserve nothing less." Elena rested against him, watching the last light fade behind the peaks, and thought about how much had changed since that first frightened carriage ride into unfamiliar territory. She had arrived here believing herself a pawn in a war she never chose, handed from one house to another, without any say in her own fate. She had built walls in those first days, certain she would need them to survive whatever cruelty awaited her in a stranger's home. Instead, she had found a man who had dreamed of her for a decade before fate finally brought them together. A man whose patience and honesty had slowly dismantled every wall she built, not through force, but through the simple, consistent proof that he meant every kind word and gentle action he offered her. She had found a community that had grown to trust her, not because a treaty demanded it, but because she had chosen, again and again, to invest herself fully in their well-being. She had found, most surprisingly of all, a version of herself stronger and more certain than the frightened young woman who had once stood in her brother's hall, listening to her future be decided without her. "Do you ever wonder," Elena asked quietly, "what would have happened if my brothers had asked me from the beginning, instead of deciding everything without me?" Damon considered the question seriously, as he always did with things that mattered to her. "I wonder sometimes," he admitted. "But I have come to believe the path itself mattered, difficult as it was. You arrived here carrying real anger, real grief over losing your choice in the matter, and every step of trust you built with me afterward was earned honestly, rather than assumed simply because the arrangement demanded it. I would not trade the true thing we built for an easier beginning that might never have led to the same depth of understanding between us." Elena thought about that for a long moment, turning it over the way she had learned to turn over difficult truths since coming to this territory, weighing pain against growth, loss against what had been gained in its place. "I think you are right," she said finally. "I do not know if I would have chosen this life for myself, if given the choice from the very beginning, but I know, without any doubt, that I choose it now, entirely and completely, exactly as it is." Damon turned to look at her, the last light of evening catching in his eyes, and Elena saw in his expression the same wonder she had first seen the day she stepped out of that carriage, when a stranger's face had somehow matched a decade of dreams he had never fully understood. "I loved you before I knew your name," he said softly. "I love you now, knowing every part of you, the strength and the fear, and the fierce loyalty you carry toward everyone you care about. There is no version of this story I would trade for another, not when it led me here, to you, exactly as we are." Elena leaned in and kissed him, the mountain air cool around them, the last light of the sun finally slipping behind the peaks that had come to feel like the boundaries of home, rather than the edges of a foreign land. She thought of the frightened woman who had once climbed into a carriage, certain she was being sent toward an ending. She understood now, with a certainty that filled every part of her, that it had never been an ending at all. It had been a beginning, waiting patiently for a decade to finally arrive. Below them, the fortress and the village beyond it settled into the quiet rhythms of evening. Two packs that had once been enemies, now woven together through years of careful, honest work, through a marriage that had started as a transaction and grown into something neither party could have predicted at the beginning. Elena Whitmore, who had arrived as a bargaining chip in a war she never chose, had become something far greater than anyone, including herself, had once believed possible. She had become exactly who she was always meant to be, standing beside the man who had dreamed of her, long before fate finally brought them together, both of them finally, completely home.